Hi, welcome back to Unit 1 Sentences. This is Lesson 4, Verbs. You'll find this information in your textbook on pages HB 12 through HB 24. You might want to grab an adult beverage, provided you're over 21. We're talking about verbs, and it's going to get ugly. Verbs are the engines of sentences, giving energy, action, and life to writing. I Googled it. Is much more vivid than I found it on the internet. And the difference is the verb. Sometimes, however, our use of verbs can obscure our meaning, as when a politician avoids taking responsibility by saying, mistakes were made, but not specifying who made the mistakes. Our choice of verbs shapes our writing in important ways, and this is all about using verbs appropriately and effectively. Verbs as a topic are pretty complicated. We're going to discuss verb tenses, forms, helping verbs, active and passive voice, mood, and phrasals with lots of breaks for comprehension checks. Take notes and review them each section. In English, we use verb tenses to express time. There are three simple tenses: present, past, and future. In addition, each of these verb tenses has aspects. An aspect refers to the state of action of a verb. There are four types of verb aspects: simple, progressive, perfect, and perfect progressive. The perfect and progressive forms indicate more complex time frames. See what I mean? Verbs are complicated, so let's just start with the basics. Simple tenses. Use the simple present to indicate actions that take place in the present or that occur habitually. I talk and I write. I'm using talk because it's a regular verb and write because it's irregular. Most wealthy industrialized countries operate national health insurance systems. The simple present tense verb is operate. We use the simple past to indicate actions that were completed in the past. I talked and I wrote. In 2010, Congress approved the Affordable Care Act. The simple past tense verb is approved. Use the simple future to indicate actions that will take place in the future. I will talk and I will write. Prohibiting English will do for the language what prohibition did for liquor. Will do is the simple future, and did is the simple past. The simple tenses are present, past, and future. They're used for actions that occurred at a specific time, either in the present, the past, or the future, but they do not state whether or not the action is finished. Now let's take it a step further to perfect tenses, which describe finished action. The present perfect indicates actions that took place at unspecified times in the past, or that began in the past and continue into the present, or have relevance in the present, such as I have talked or I have written. You'll notice each perfect tense requires a helping verb. In the sentence, many teachers and parents have resisted the increasing pressure for more standardized testing of students. The present perfect verb is have resisted. Use the past perfect for an action that was completed before another past action began, such as, by the time I was born, the Gulf War had already ended. The past perfect verb is had ended. Already is an adverb telling when. Use the future perfect to indicate actions that will be completed at a specific time in the future. By this time next year, you will have graduated. The future perfect verb is will have graduated. Perfect tense requires a helping or auxiliary verb and indicates action that began and continued in the past. Let's kick it up a notch to progressive tenses. They indicate unfinished action, such as I am talking and I am writing, which is present progressive. The past progressive is I was talking and I was writing. and future progressive, which is I will be talking and I will be writing. Progressive tenses indicate ongoing, unfinished action. Perfect progressive tenses describe an action that was in progress but was then finished. The present perfect progressive tense is used for actions that began in the past and continue into the present, such as I have been talking and I have been writing. The past and future perfect progressive tenses mark the end of an ongoing action. I had been talking, but I'm not anymore, and I had been writing, but I'm not now. Or, I will have been talking for 30 minutes at the end of this video, and I will have been writing. So perfect progressive tenses are for actions that went on for a while, but are now finished. Here are some more advanced examples. The Heat are having a great year, but the Spurs are leading the league. The present progressive verbs are having and are leading. We were watching TV when the doorbell rang includes the past progressive were watching. During the World Cup, soccer fans around the world will be watching on TV or online is an example of future progressive tense. Willie joined the Grace Church Boys Choir when he was 10, and he's been singing ever since. Is which tense? If you said present perfect progressive, you are 100% correct. Let's pause for a sec and review verb tenses. English verbs have 3 simple tenses: present, past, and future. Perfect tenses describe completed actions. They are present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. Progressive tenses describe unfinished actions. Present, past, and future progressives are actions that are ongoing, unfinished action. Present, past, and future perfect progressive tenses are actions that were in progress but are now finished. Let's do a quick check. Has your head exploded yet? No? Awesome, because we're just getting started. And we're off to verb forms. There are 4 forms of a verb: the base form, the past participle, and the present participle. In the sentence, on Thursdays, we visit a museum, visit is the base form of the verb. The past tense and the past participle of all regular verbs are formed by adding ed or d to the base form, such as talked or lived. Irregular verbs are not as predictable. In this sentence, last week we visited the Museum of Modern Art. The past tense verb visited is formed by adding ed to the end of visit. The difference between the past tense of the verb and the past participle is that the past participle has the helping verb. I have also visited the Metropolitan Museum, but I have not yet been to the cloisters. Includes the past participles have visited and have been. For now, just ignore the words in between. We'll talk about those eventually. The present participle consists of the base form plus ing, such as talking or living. In this sentence, will be visiting is the present participle verb. It's easy to get confused about when to use the past tense and when to use the past participle. One simple guideline is to use the past tense if there is no helping verb, and to use a past participle if there is one. For vacation last summer, my family went to the Outer Banks. Uses the past tense of go, which is went. The past participle would be my family had gone to the Outer Banks. After a week at the beach, we had eaten a lot of seafood. Uses the past participle. We touched on gerunds and infinitives in a previous lesson. We're going to look at them again now. A gerund is a verb form ending in ing that functions as a noun, such as hopping, skipping, and jumping. In the sentence, although many people like driving, some prefer walking, the gerunds are driving and walking. Gerunds express plain facts. An infinitive is a verb form made up of to plus the base form of the verb, such as to hop, to skip, and to jump. In the sentence, although many people like to drive, some prefer to walk, the infinitives are to drive and to walk. In general, use infinitives to express intentions or desires. Quiz time! As I read the following sentences, identify the verb in each and decide if it's a gerund or an infinitive. Number 1, I plan to learn Spanish, Japanese, and Arabic. Number 2, I also wanted to study Russian. Number 3, unfortunately, I ended up studying only Spanish and Arabic and speaking only Spanish. And finally, number 4, just in time for Thanksgiving, the painters finished putting up the wallpaper. Okay, let's see how you did. For number 1, the verb is to learn, and it's an infinitive. In number 2, the verb is to study, also an infinitive. Number 3 has 2 verbs, studying and speaking, which are both gerunds. And in number 4, the verb is putting or putting up, which is a gerund. Now that we've nailed down the basics on gerunds and infinitives, let's look at a couple of things about their use. Some verbs can be followed by either a gerund or an infinitive without changing the meaning, such as the verbs begin, continue, like, and prefer, for example. I begin eating is pretty equivalent to I begin to eat. However, with some verbs, there's a big difference, as in the case with forget, remember, and stop. There's a world of difference between I stopped to eat and I stopped eating. And you always have to follow a preposition with a gerund and not an infinitive. The water is too cold for swimming makes sense, but the water is too cold for to swim does not. And that's enough about forms. But before we move on, let's do a short review on the 4 verb forms. The base form is the verb's present tense. The past tense form adds ed to the end of a regular verb. The past participle adds an auxiliary verb to the present tense verb form. The present participle adds an auxiliary verb to the ing verb form. When you use the ing verb form as a noun, that's called a gerund, and an infinitive is to plus the base verb form. Let's move on to auxiliary or helping verbs. The verbs do, have, and be, along with modals such as can and may, all function as helping verbs that are used with main verbs to form certain tenses and moods. Do, have, and be change form to indicate different tenses. Modals do not. Do, have, and be are all irregular. Do also comes in the forms does and did. As a helping verb, do requires the base form of the main verb, such as I do not like to answer questions aloud in class. The complete verb is do like. Have's other forms are has and had. The have forms require the past participle of the main verb, as in, I have applied for college. Be has several forms: be, am, is, are, was, were, and been. Use a be form with a present participle to indicate continuing action. He is considering a change in tone. You can also add it to a past participle to create passive voice. More about that in a minute. In this sentence, 6 classes is considered enough. The verb is considered. So those are our friends, the helping verbs. They are combined with another verb to express a complex time frame. Modals are a special kind of helping verbs that have to do with probability. Can, could, may, might, must, ought to, shall, should, will, and would are used with the base form of a main verb to express whether an action is likely, possible, permitted, or various other conditions. Modals don't take the third person s or ing endings that ordinary verbs do. To express likelihood, we use the modals will, could, ought to, may, and might. If an outcome is very certain, use will. The Spurs will win tomorrow. If the outcome is somewhat certain, could is your modal of choice. The Lakers could defeat the Heat. When the situation is only moderately certain, use ought to. It ought to be a close series. For a less certain outcome, use may. The Rockets may win their game tonight. And when an occurrence is unlikely, use might. The Knicks might make the playoffs someday. For assumptions, use the modal must. The dog just started barking. He must hear our guests arriving. When there is a reasonable expectation of an outcome, use should or ought to. 2 large onions should be enough for this recipe. The potatoes ought to be ready in 20 minutes. To indicate ability, use can or could. Mick Jagger can still put on quite a show. How much longer will he be able to continue? When an action is necessary or obligatory, use must, should, or ought to. Travelers must have a passport for foreign travel. We should leave early tomorrow. You ought to get to the airport at least 2 hours early. For permissions or requests, use may, can, could, would, and will. People traveling with small children may board early. The hotel's check-in time is 4 p.m., but travelers can often check in earlier. Would someone help me put my bag in the overhead bin? Will you please turn off your phone? For advice, use should or ought to, as in, you should never text while driving, or you ought to be careful about using public Wi-Fi. To indicate intention, use will and shall. Mariana will bring an apple pie for Thanksgiving. We shall overcome. Before we move on to zombies, let's review auxiliary or helping verbs. Do, have, and be, along with modals such as can and may, are helping verbs used with main verbs to form certain tenses and moods. Do, have, and be change form to indicate different tenses. Modals do not. Modals indicate likelihood, assumptions, a necessary or obligatory action, and advice. Active and passive voice indicate whether the subject is performing the action, which is active voice, or receiving the action, that's passive voice. A sentence that's written in active voice, where the subject is performing the action, is a stronger, more desirable sentence. For example, Hank petted the llama. Hank is performing the action, and the direct object, the llama, is receiving it. Active voice is straightforward and leaves no wiggle room. Passive voice, on the other hand, I also call weasel words. Some stuff happened, and I'm not saying who did it, but it wasn't me. Avoid passive voice. It's weak because it indicates the writer is uncertain about what's going on. Politicians and big pharma use passive voice a lot. An active verb becomes passive when you use a helping verb with it. I was told. Mistakes were made. Side effects have occurred. But it's not anybody's fault, especially not ours. By the way, a good way to determine if a sentence is written in passive voice is to tack by zombies to the end. I was told by zombies. Mistakes were made by zombies. Side effects have occurred by zombies. To review, English has 2 voices, active and passive. Use active voice whenever possible. Okay, let's move on to mood. English verbs have three: indicative, imperative, and subjunctive. The indicative mood states facts, opinions, or questions. Habitat for Humanity has built 12 houses this year. The verb has built is indicative. In what other volunteer opportunities does Habitat offer? The verb is does offer. The imperative mood is used to give commands or directions. Sit up straight and do your work. Moms and teachers are heavy users of imperatives. The subject of an imperative, by the way, is the unstated but understood you. If I'm looking at you and I say, get your feet off the coffee table, I don't need to add you in the front of my directive. The subjunctive mood indicates unlikely or hypothetical conditions, or expresses wishes, requests, or requirements. For example, we would be happier if we had less pressure at work. My mother wishes my brother were more responsible with his money. In this last sentence, the verb write is subjunctive because it's the requirement of most colleges. The subjunctive has two types: one that is the same form as the past tense and one that is the same as the base form. The subjunctive is used most often in conditional sentences, ones that include a clause beginning with if or another word that states a condition. Use the indicative in the if clause to show that you are confident the condition is possible. If an earthquake strikes there, experts predict a tsunami. A century ago, if a hurricane struck, residents had little warning. If you follow that diet for 2 weeks, you'll lose about 10 pounds. When the outcome is unlikely, impossible, or hypothetical, use subjunctive in the if clause and would, could, or might plus the base verb in the other. If I won the lottery, I could pay off my student loans. The subjunctive is won in the if clause with could plus the base verb pay in the other. If MLK were alive, he would acknowledge progress in race relations, but he would also ask significant questions. The subjunctive is were in the if clause and would plus the base form acknowledge and would plus the base form ask. Subjunctive mood trips up even native English speakers. Our inclination is to use the simple past tense when the if clause is unlikely or impossible or hypothetical. We want to say, if I was a rich man, but grammatically, it is correct to say, if I were a rich man, I wouldn't have to work hard. Or Marcia wishes she were living, not was living, in Paris. When the if clause is about a past event that never happened, use the past perfect in the if clause and would have or could have or might have plus the past participle of the verb in the other clause. If the cops had separated the witnesses, their evidence would have been admissible. In that clauses, following verbs such as ask, insist, or suggest, use the subjunctive to express a request, a recommendation, or demand. Use the base form of the verb in the that clause. In this sentence, I recommended that Hannah study French as an undergraduate. The subjunctive verb is study. The CEO will insist that you be at your desk before 9 each morning. Here, the subjunctive is be, since this is a demand by the boss. Let's recap mood before we move on to phrasals. Use the indicative mood to state a fact, and the imperative to give commands or directions. The subjunctive mood indicates unlikely or hypothetical conditions or expresses wishes, requests, or requirements. Verbs are just verb phrases composed of more than one word, like act up, back down, or carry on. A phrasal is usually a verb and a preposition. You know what act means, and you know what up means. but if you're not a native English speaker, you may need to check a dictionary to find out that act up means to misbehave. With phrasal verbs, knowing the meaning of each part does not always help you to know what the phrasal verb itself means. Phrasal verbs can be divided into two categories, separable and inseparable. With separable verbs, the parts can be split by an object. I used to look up words in a dictionary. Now I look them up on my phone. Includes lookup both ways. An inseparable phrasal can't be split, such as Jim and his family are caring for his elderly mother. With separable phrasal verbs, you have a choice. You can put the object between the parts or after the complete phrasal verb. With a hurricane forming nearby, NASA called off tomorrow's lunar launch. And NASA called the launch off. When the object is a long phrase, however, it almost always follows the complete verb. NASA engineers called off the launch of the lunar mission scheduled for tomorrow. The personal pronouns me, you, him, her, it, us, and them are almost always placed between the parts. The launch was scheduled for yesterday, but NASA called it off because of the weather. Sounds much better than called off it. Some phrasal verbs never take an object. For example, come over, meaning to visit, and catch on, meaning to become. Why don't you come over and see us sometime? And developers were astonished at how quickly the app caught on. With some phrasal verbs, the meaning changes depending on whether or not there is an object. To look something up, for instance, means to find information. Without an object, to look up means to get better. When in doubt, look up phrasal verbs in the dictionary. Lookup has an object and means to find information. The lookup in the sun's out and roses are in bloom, things are looking up, doesn't have an object and means things are getting better. For a glossary of phrasal verbs, go to www.norton.com/write/field guide links. Phrasals are verb phrases. Separable phrasals can be split by object, inseparable phrasals can't. And sometimes having an object changes the meaning of a phrasal. That's it. Stick a fork in me. I'm done. I cannot yammer about grammar another minute. If you have questions, please consult your textbook. This Odyssey is on pages HB 12 through HB 24. If you still have questions after that, email me or ask me in class. If you email and don't hear back in 24 hours, try my FWSD address. Thanks for hanging in here as we slogged through the intricacies of verbs. Be sure to check Canvas and complete all the quizzes on verbs. I'll see you next time for Lesson 5, Subject-Verb Agreement. And thanks to Slides Carnival and Unsplash for their slides template. See you next time.